diagram of the nervous system intertwined with a house floor plan, a pale filament flickering.
The plastic casing of the VHS tape felt unnervingly warm, as if it had been incubating in the humidity of the crawl space for decades. Rather than sitting dormant, it was tucked behind a false brick in the basement of Elias's childhood home house that had always smelled of copper and damp newspaper. The label was written in his father's precise, architectural script, instructions for my replacement. Below it, in a smaller, more frantic hand, was the title that made the air in the room turn to ice, How to Be Me. Elias's father had been buried for 3 days, yet the weight of his absence felt less like grief and more like a predator that had finally stopped breathing but hadn't yet gone cold. The VCR groaned, a mechanical protest against the age of the magnetic tape. On the screen, the static didn't just flicker. It swirled in rhythmic, organic patterns, looking less like electronic interference and more like a swarm of gnats over a carcass. Then the image stabilized. His father sat in a high-backed chair, the shadows behind him so deep they seemed to have physical mass. He looked spoiled. That was the only word Elias could find. His skin looked loose, draped over his frame like wet velvet that had begun to slide. There was a wetness to his eyes that wasn't tears, but a slow, viscous leak of internal fluids. The narration on the tape began not with a greeting, but with a warning about the sensation of the shift. His father's voice sounded like two pieces of dry leather rubbing together. He explained that the lineage of the Vance man was not a biological progression of birth and growth, but a cycle of shedding and mimicry. Elias wasn't his father's son in any sense that a doctor would understand. He was a biological contingency, a fresh coat of paint applied over a rotting fence. The tape detailed the spoiling, the inevitable moment, when the previous vessel's cellular integrity failed, and the replacement was triggered to begin the harvest of the predecessor's identity. As the video played, Elias felt a prickling heat along the nape of his neck. It was the sensation of being watched by a shadow that had no owner. The tape instructed him to look at his own fingernails. He looked. In the dim light of the basement, the luminal of the white half-moons at the base had turned a bruised, necrotic purple. His father on the screen smiled, revealing teeth that looked too numerous for a human mouth. Explained that the transition was already 48% complete. The man Elias called Dad hadn't been a man at all, but a manifestation that had finally reached its expiration date. The runes seemed to shrink. Concrete walls of the basement felt like they were leaning inward, sweating a thin, translucent ichor that mirrored the film on his father's skin. The narration grew more technical, describing the exposing to fully become the replacement. Elias would have to endure the trauma of the unskinning. He would need to find the maternal source. Hidden within the house's foundation, the thing that birthed the manifestations. His father spoke of the shadow self, a secondary consciousness that lived in the periphery of one's vision, waiting for the moment the primary ego decayed enough to let the new one slide in. Every creak of the house above him now sounded like a rhythmic, wet thud. Elias realized with a jolt of visceral terror that he could hear his father's voice, not just from the television speakers, but echoing faintly from the pipes in the wall. The tape showed a diagram, a hand-drawn map of the human nervous system, intertwined with the floor plan of the house. The two were indistinguishable. To live in the house was to live inside the nervous system of the Vance lineage. The trauma of his childhood, the night spent locked in dark closets. The exercises where his father made him mimic his every gesture for hours. In front of a mirror wasn't abuse. It was calibration. The video shifted to a close-up of his father's ear. A small, pale filament like a root or a white worm flickered out of the ear canal and retracted. The narrator explained that the spoiling begins with the loss of individual thought. Soon, Elias would start to remember things he had never experienced. He would remember the Great Depression. He would remember the taste of soil from 1890. He would remember the sensation of being buried alive. Because every Vance man ended his cycle as the mulch for the next. The replacement was a parasite of memory, a biological revenge against time itself. Elias tried to stand, but his legs felt heavy, the muscles turning to a texture like overcooked meat. His vision blurred, the edges of the room fraying into darkness. He felt a sudden, sharp pressure behind his eyes, as if someone were trying to push a thumb through his skull from the inside. The screen went black, leaving only the sound of a wet, rhythmic breathing coming from the corner of the basement where the sump pump sat. The The shadows there began to detach themselves from the floor. They didn't move like light-cast images. They moved like spilled ink, thick and purposeful. Elias realized the instructions weren't just a guide. They were a ritual in progress. The act of watching the tape had triggered the final stage of the metamorphosis. He looked back at the screen as a final image flickered on, a shot of the very basement he was sitting in, filmed from the perspective of the sump pump dot in the video. He could see himself sitting in the chair, but his reflection in the dark glass of the TV showed something else, a tall, faceless shape standing directly behind him, its long, multi-jointed fingers reaching for his throat. As the real world, Elias felt the cold, damp touch of those fingers on his skin. The voice on the tape whispered one last instruction: don't scream. Elias, you'll only tear the new throat before it's finished curing, then. Power in the house cut out, plunging him into an absolute, suffocating darkness that felt like being swallowed whole. The darkness in the basement was not an absence of light, but a physical weight of thick, velvet shroud that tasted of iron and ancient, stagnant water. Elias sat motionless, his lungs burning as he tried to regulate his breathing. Every time he inhaled, the air felt textured as if he were breathing in microscopic shards of bone. He could feel the presence behind him, the predecessor, shifting with a sound like wet silk, sliding over gravel. It didn't strike, it waited. It was a guardian of the threshold, ensuring that the spoiling reached the necessary depth before the next phase could begin. When the emergency light on the far wall finally flickered to a dim, sickly orange, the basement had transformed. Concrete floor felt soft, almost spongy, and the shadows didn't retreat from the light. They huddled in the corners like bruised fruit, pulsating with a low, subharmonic hum. Elias looked at his hands. The skin was beginning to lose its opacity. He could see the dark, purple machinery of his veins shifting beneath the surface, reconfiguring themselves into patterns that matched the architectural sketches on his father's tape. Unskinning was no longer a metaphor. It was a structural necessity. The narration resumed, though the VCR was dead. The voice vibrated directly into his inner ear, a resonant frequency that bypassed his eardrums. It spoke of the maternal source, the subterranean womb that sat beneath the foundation. It explained that the Vance men were not born of women, but harvested from the shadow loam. The women Elias remembered, the mother who had left when he was 5, were merely biological placeholders, intellectual decoys used to provide the manifestation with a sense of social camouflage. The trauma of her disappearance flared in his mind, but it was quickly suppressed by a surge of cold, artificial memory. He remembered her not as a person, but as a nutrient host that had been discarded once his own germination was complete, driven by a compulsion that felt like a wire being pulled through his spine. Elias began to tear at the floorboards near the sump pump. His fingernails, now hardened into keratinous claws, ripped through the wood and earth with terrifying ease. Beneath the house lay a layer of black, oily peat that smelled of 1,000 years of rot. As he dug, the exposed truth began to manifest in his mind. He wasn't digging a hole. He was opening a pore. The house groaned above him, the sound of the joists twisting like the ribs of a dying giant. The spoiling of his father's generation had reached its peak. The house was demanding its fresh layer of identity. He reached a metallic surface, the cornerstone mentioned in the tape. It wasn't stone, but a rusted iron hatch encrusted with a translucent amber-colored resin. Inside the resin were suspended objects, teeth, wedding rings, spectacles, and locks of hair. These were the discarded specs, remnants of previous replacements who had failed to fully integrate. Elias felt a wave of visceral revenge, not against his father, but against the very biology that had condemned him to this cycle. He wanted to scream, to burn the house down, but his vocal cords were tightening, hardening into the leather-like chords of his father's voice. The hatch opened with a sound like a wet seal breaking. Below it was a vertical shaft, lined with the same pulsating, vein-streaked membrane he had seen in the blueprints. This was the throat of the house. The air rising from the shaft was hot and carried the unmistakable scent of a feverish animal. The narration in his head grew louder, more frantic, urging him to descend. It told him that the replacement must be bathed in the primordial ichor to finalize the mimicry. If he stayed above, he would remain a half-form, a shrieking, skinless thing that would be hunted by the very shadows he was meant to command. As he lowered himself into the shaft, the walls began to constrict. This was the claustrophobia of the womb, a crushing, rhythmic pressure that forced the air from his chest. He felt his ribs cracking and resetting, his body being molded by the house to fit a specific, preordained shape. The trauma was the kiln. The sensation was the hammer. He was being forged into a vessel for a ghost. The deeper he went, the more the shadow self began to merge with his own consciousness. He saw flashes of his father's life, not the memories of a parent, but the tactical data of a predator. He saw how to smile to hide the extra teeth, how to walk to disguise the multi-jointed legs, how to love just enough to keep the nutrient host from fleeing too early. At the bottom of the shaft, Elias stood in a chamber of absolute anatomical horror. The walls were made of calcified bone, and the floor was a pool of thick, black liquid that mirrored the static of the VHS tape. In the center of the pool sat a throne-like apparatus made of rusted surgical steel and fused spinal columns, and sitting on that throne was his father. Not the man in the casket, but the true spoiled form, a massive, bloated landscape of pale flesh, covered in thousands of unblinking eyes that tracked Elias's every movement. The creature's mouth didn't move, but the voice exploded in Elias's skull, a chorus of 100 Vance men. It told him that the instruction was almost complete. The final step of how to be me required the replacement to consume the core of the predecessor. He had to take the trauma, the memories, and the literal substance of the one who came before, or the cycle would break and the house would collapse into a void of non-existence. Elias approached the mass, his own skin now weeping a clear, sticky fluid. He reached out to touch the true form, but as his fingers made contact, the eyes on his father's body began to migrate. They slid across the pale flesh like oil on water, moving toward Elias's arm, leaping from the old skin to the new. The sensation was an agonizing electric fire. He wasn't just inheriting a name. He was being overridden. Suddenly, the predecessor lashed out, multi-jointed limb wrapping around Elias's throat with a strength that felt like a hydraulic press. Preacher's face, a mosaic of every man who had ever lived in the house, leaned close to his. "You think you are the one replacing me," the chorus hissed, "but you are only the new skin for the same hunger. Look at the wall, Elias. Look at what happens to the replacement who asks too many questions." Fringe light flickered, revealing a row of alcoves in the bone walls. In each one sat a figure, perfectly preserved. Looking exactly like Elias, they were frozen in various stages of the unskinning, their faces twisted and permanent. Silent screams. Elias felt his consciousness beginning to fragment, the shadow self clawing at the inside of his mind to take control. He realized with a jolt of terror that the tape hadn't been a guide for him, it had been a lure to bring the new meat to the slaughterhouse. The replacement wasn't a successor. It was a meal. As the grip on his throat tightened, the black pool began to rise, the liquid climbing his legs like a living thing, intent on dragging him down into the Foundation's dark heart. The pressure around Elias's throat was not merely physical. It was an intrusion of identity. As the predecessor's grip tightened, Elias felt a psychic backwash, a flood of oily, black memories that didn't belong to him forced into the gaps of his fracturing mind. He saw the house being built in 1890, not by carpenters, but by men with the same bruised fingernails and too many teeth whispering to the timber. He felt the hunger of the soil, a ravenous, subterranean intelligence that demanded a human interface to interact with the world of light. He was being force-fed a century of predatory survival, the instructions now manifesting as a literal rewiring of his brain. The black liquid from the pool reached his waist, and the temperature dropped to a point that should have been lethal. Yet, Elias didn't die. His new, translucent skin thrived in the cold. Purple veins beneath his surface glowing with a rhythmic, bioluminescent throb. The maternal source was recognizing him. The house's foundation began to pulse in time with his own double-beat heart. He realized then that the exposed truth was even grimmer. The Vance men were not just manifestations. They were sensory organs for the house itself. They were the eyes it used to watch the street, the hands it used to lure in nutrient hosts, and the mouths it used to scream when the earth shifted. The bloated mass on the throne, the true form of his father, began to slough off its outer layers. Great sheets of gray, parchment-like skin fell into the black pool, dissolving instantly. The eyes that had migrated to Elias's skin began to blink in unison, granting him a 360-degree view of the chamber. He saw the alcoves of his predecessors, the failed replacements, and realized they weren't dead. Their nerves were still entwined with the bone walls, their suffering used as a low-grade power source to keep the shadow loom spinning. This was the trauma mentioned in the tape of perpetual, recycled agony that acted as the glue for the house's reality. The chorus of voices in his head shifted from instructions to a rhythmic, droning chant. They were demanding the harvest. Elias felt a hollow, aching void opening in his stomach, a hunger that no food could satisfy. It was a hunger for being. He looked at the creature on the throne and for the first time felt a surge of metamorphosis fueled by spite. If he was to be the replacement, he would not be the meal. He would be the glutton. The revenge against his lineage sparked in his marrow. He would consume the predecessor before the predecessor could finish the unskinning. He lunged forward, his multi-jointed limbs moving with a sickening, fluid grace he hadn't possessed an hour ago. He didn't use his hands. He used the shadow self that now extended from his back like tattered obsidian wings. He tore into the pale mound of the predecessor, and the taste was not of flesh but of time. It tasted of old photographs, of his father's architectural drawings, of the copper scent of the basement. With every bite, Elias's own features began to stabilize. His skin thickened, turning the familiar, healthy tan of his youth. But it was a lie mask harder than any bone dot as he consumed the core. The house reacted violently. The architecture above him screamed as the joists snapped and the plaster cracked. The exposed nerves of the building were being rerouted to Elias. He felt the plumbing in his veins, the electrical wiring in his nerves, and the attic's vast, empty silence in his skull. He was no longer a man standing in a basement. He was the basement. He was the hallway. He was the locked closet. The sensation was overwhelming, a godlike expansion of consciousness that threatened to dissolve his ego into the floorboards. But the predecessor was not going quietly. From within the mass Elias was devouring, a hand reached out, a small, delicate hand that didn't match the monster. It was his mother's hand, then his grandfather's, then a dozen others. They clawed at his face, trying to drag him into the collective spoiling. The voices in his head became a cacophony of how to be me, each one a different version of the same lie. They tried to trick him into remembering a childhood that never happened, trying to settle him into the comfortable, domestic rhythm of a replacement who doesn't know he's a ghost. Elias fought back, his mind a serrated blade of realistic terror. He focused on the VHS tape, the physical object that had started this. He realized the tape wasn't just instructions. It was a tether. It was the last piece of the old manifestation's ego. If he could destroy the source of the recording, he could sever the connection to the previous generation and claim the house for himself. Breaking the cycle of being a secondary manifestation, he scrambled back toward the vertical shaft. The black liquid now a churning vortex of discarded memories and shadow metabolism. The creature on the throne was now a skeletal, weeping thing, its spoiling nearly complete. It reached out one last time, its voice a pathetic, watery wheeze. You think you are winning, Elias. The house doesn't want a master. It wants a fresh set of lungs to breathe the rot. Elias ignored the voice and began the agonizing climb back up the throat of the house above him. The emergency light had died, but he didn't need it. He could see through the walls. He could see the VCR in the basement above. The magnetic tape still threaded through the machine like a parasite's entrails. He could see the shadow loom in the attic preparing the next nutrient host. A woman he had met 3 weeks ago, already being drawn to the house by a manifestation of charm he didn't even know. He had been projecting. He burst through the floorboards of the basement, his body smoking with the friction of the climb. He grabbed the VCR, the plastic burning his hands. He began to pull the tape out by the handful, the black film screaming as it tore. But as the last of the tape unspooled, he felt a sharp, rhythmic thudding beneath his feet. The house wasn't falling apart. It was contracting. He looked at the basement stairs, but they were gone. In their place was a wall of solid, throbbing meat. The exposed truth hit him like a physical blow. He had consumed the predecessor, but in doing so, he had completed the replacement faster than the house had ever seen. The instructions were finished. The house began to tilt, the ground outside the small basement windows rising as the entire structure began to sink back into the earth. Elias realized with a jolt of claustrophobic horror that the maternal source was closing its pore. The replacement was being tucked back into the womb for a period of gestation that could last decades. The last thing he saw before the windows were covered by black soil was the VCR, even without power. The small digital clock on the front began to count backward, the red numbers flickering with a frantic, rhythmic pulse. Then, the floor beneath him turned into a tongue and began to swallow. The descent was no longer a fall. It was an integration. Elias felt the house's shadow loom, weaving itself into his very DNA, replacing his human frailty with the immutable, cold logic of the estate. He was being pulled into the deep core, the subterranean space where the house kept its most precious archives. The claustrophobia was absolute. He was encased in a 10 by 10 chamber of dense, rhythmic muscle that hummed with the collective consciousness of every Vance man who had ever spoiled. He was no longer a person. He was a stored file, a biological backup waiting for the next exposing. The trauma of his existence finally reached its peak. In the absolute dark of the core, Elias saw the final blueprint. It wasn't drawn on vellum, but burned into the back of his retinas. The house was not a home, and it wasn't just an entity. It was a trap designed by a primordial hunger to ensure its own immortality. The instructions for my replacement were never meant to help him. They were the code for his own deletion. He saw the faces of the future, a long line of Elias shapes stretching into a dark, simulated eternity. The revenge he had felt in the basement was a programmed emotion, a catalyst to ensure he would fight hard enough to be the strongest possible manifestation. As the house's gestation cycle settled, the silence became more terrifying than the screaming. Elias could feel the world above the Oregon rain, the distant sound of tires on asphalt fading into a muffled vibration. He was the root now. He felt his legs elongate, his toes spreading into the soil, seeking the dark nutrients of the earth. His arms fused into the walls of the core, his fingers becoming the copper wiring that would eventually carry the signals of the next tape. Metamorphosis was complete. He was the architecture. Then a flicker of light pierced the gloom of his consciousness. It wasn't his flashlight, but a memory, a realistic anchor. He remembered the woman he had invited over, the nutrient host the house was already prepping. Through the house's eyes, the windows on the second floor, he saw her car pull into the driveway. She looked at the house with a mixture of concern and curiosity. She was holding a key he had given her. The shadow self within Elias surged with a sickening, predatory joy. He felt the house's front door unpucker, the wood softening to allow her entry. Elias tried to scream a warning, to use the house's vents to howl for her to run, but the instructions were too deep. When his mouth opened, it didn't produce a scream. It produced the sound of a grandfather clock ticking. When he tried to thrash his limbs, the floorboards merely groaned a welcoming, sturdy rhythm. He was the perfect mimic. He was Dad, he was Grandpa, he was the Vance lineage. The woman stepped inside. "Elias," she called out, her voice echoing through his throat. He felt her footsteps on his tongue. She was walking toward the basement door. The house, sensing her proximity, began to manufacture a fresh manifestation. From the black pool in the core, a new shape began to rise, a perfect, unspoiled version of Elias. It had his eyes, his smile, and his favorite sweater. It was the replacement for the replacement. Elias, the true Elias, was now relegated to the subconscious of the building, a silent observer in the biological archive. He watched as the new manifestation met her at the top of the stairs. He heard the manifestation speak in his own voice, perfectly calibrated, full of warmth and false vulnerability. "I'm down here," the manifestation said. "I found something incredible. My father left me some tapes. Come and see." The cycle locked. The revenge was complete, not for Elias, but for the house. It had successfully shed its old, rotting skin and put on a fresh, vibrant face. The instructions for my replacement had been followed to the letter. As the basement door clicked shut with a wet, fleshy sound, the real Elias felt his consciousness finally begin to spoil. He began to dissolve into the black peat, his memories becoming nothing more than a hum in the walls. The last thing he felt was a sense of profound, horrific peace. He wasn't the man anymore. He was the 10 by 10 square. He was the void. The house breathed. Inhale, pause, exhale. The screen of the world went black, leaving only the sound of a VCR rewinding in the dark, preparing for the next viewer.